Hello, everyone. I'm H Lombaert, and I will be presenting today at the summer school on deep learning for medical imaging, geometric deep learning in medical imaging. So I'll be sharing with you a few thoughts on geometric deep learning in general. But first, you may wonder, who is this guy, basically? So I'm a research scientist. I'm a professor as well in Montreal. I've been studying shapes and images for the past 15 years. And what's really fascinating to me is like geometry, shape that does occur in many places in anatomy and in medical imaging in general. So from computer graphics, computer vision, what really intrigues me a lot is shapes that you find in the human body. One of them is, for example, the brain. You've probably seen the brain. The surface is highly folded, highly convoluted, we say. And how to analyze, how to process such geometry. That's what we'll be talking about today. So, for example, a typical problem would be how to find correspondences between shapes. So shapes can be moving a lot, deforming a lot. How do you find a segmentation problem? How do you parcellate different portions, different parts of the brain, for example? How do you do a problem of classification if you have data that lives on the surface? For example, it can be functional data, it can be different measurements that you find on the surface, and how do you use that in a learning method to do classification, regression, whatever tasks you need to do. First, we're gonna start with images. So you've probably seen this many times. Imagine you have a simple problem here. You have a brain, a slice of the brain. That's a 2D image here. You can imagine the same thing in 3 dimension. But from those images, you want to find where is a tumor and what are the different categories of the tumor here. So to train this, multiple algorithms exist, but it typically tries to learn from an algorithm from a data set that has a lot of manual annotations. So for example, here, that's an example where you have, let me try to point this. So from a ground truth here, where you have a lot of experts that segmented manually those images, you want to try to find an algorithm that would learn what creates, what are the patterns that creates the right segmentation and the right categories of regions here. So that's all fine. But how do you do this in practice? So if we go back a little bit on medical imaging, so in the summer school, you've probably seen other aspects or other topics on how to work on images. So a brief reminder here, you usually use a convolution neural net. On medical imaging, though, you may need a bit more. Typically, images are highly, in 3 dimension in particular, highly voluminous. So you try to convolute a kernel on multiple resolutions here. So this is one approach of, for example, here DeepImaging. There's multiple other ones. So that creates a final segmentation that you do have on the brain here. So unfortunately, here on Zoom, the video doesn't necessarily play, but that would be a scan where you see what's inside the brain here with the right segmentation. Different work. As I said, it's a very active field. And this is not the topic of this presentation. So we have one issue with images. That's fine. It typically relies on having your data on a grid, for example. So you basically know where your neighbors are. But how do you do the same algorithm on the brain, where, for example, on an image, you know where is your left and right and up and down neighbors. But how do you do that on a brain surface? Particularly if you look closely on a brain, it's highly folded, highly convoluted here. So sometimes if you walk on the surface, you can even find yourself upside down. So navigating on the brain is not necessarily a trivial, easy problem. First of all, like, why should we learn on a surface? In medical imaging, we have multiple types of data that typically lives on the surface. We find surface parts, portions of the brain that is fundamentally a portion of the mesh. You have functional data, functional imaging. Those are signals that come from the neuron body cells. Those are mostly lying on the thin surface of the brain. So that's fundamentally a surface data. So that's one of the main reasons why we want to learn on a surface field. So if we look closely, the main problem of using a typical CNNs or typical image-based algorithm on a surface problem. For example, if you take two neighboring peak points, they can be two neighboring pixels here. You have a very small distance here. It's one pixel difference here. But if you look the distance between them on a surface, you actually need to move or to walk a lot on the surface between finding the same corresponding point here. So that creates a confusion for a learning algorithm. If you use an image-based algorithm, though you would think those 2 points are actually neighbors, so it will aggregate or convolve data together, while in fact you shouldn't. In fact, you should aggregate points on the surface here, so it doesn't know where the surface is. So how to do that on surfaces? That's what we'll talk about. So if you want to do a convolution on a surface here, imagine you have a grid, you have a small kernel, basically that's trying to learn what are the height or what are the weight of the red bars that you have here on the neighboring pixel at one point. And then it convolves, moves around basically this cell and then try to convolve this on images. That's fine. But how do you move from a grid to something that is not a grid anymore on a graph, for example, on a triangulated mesh here? So that creates all sorts of typical problem here. But the main rationale here is to try to learn still. We want to have a few kernels that tries to find, to do a convolution basically on the surface here. So you want to find out what are averages around the small portions in the neighborhood here. And you would learn here what are the positions of these kernels. So it could be, for example, the Gaussian, the kernel centers and the Gaussian covariances here, for example. So that's what we want to do here. So we still have a problem here on mesh. How do you represent a point? So one naive way would be to find or to represent a point in the Euclidean or Cartesian here coordinates, and using their x, y, z points. So that's okay. But ideally, since we basically work on surfaces, we want to represent the points using what I would call a shape coordinate. Those shape coordinates would really live on the surface itself. So that means if you increase those coordinates, you will start to navigate on this grain here. So that's the core idea here of working on surfaces. One typical problem here, for example, on the brain, you have a huge variability, not only in the global shape. You see here more elongated brain or more like more spherical brains, for example. But you have a lot of variability in the folding here. If you go really in the small details, it's highly variable across patients, subjects here. So if you want to find a corresponding point between brains, that's not as easy as it may seem here, because of this high geometrical variability. So that raises the problem of how to find points between brains. The typical way of classical way of finding corresponding points would be to try to morph the images, try to morph the surfaces here one into another. So that's fine, but it's extremely costly, very elegant mathematics, but slightly costly and hardly scalable on the mesh of sizes that we find on brain surfaces. Those are typically 300,000 nodes for one brain. So on the particular problem of brain matching, we like to inflate or simplify a complex brain surface to a very simplified sphere, for example. So we inflate the brain to a sphere, and then we manipulate those spheres to find those matching. That's fine, but the inflation process, if you want to minimize some kind of metrics and so on, distortion side, that is a costly algorithm as well. So that's up to a few hours of computations just to find a matching between two surfaces, two subjects. And using spectral matching methods, so that takes roughly a few seconds. So that's great. And those typically works on very high dense meshes of 300,000 nodes. So that's what we will see how to do this together. So first, a few background on spectral shape analysis that will become relevant on geometric deep learning. So you've probably seen this experiment. So that should be a video playing here, but again, as in Zoom, videos doesn't necessarily play well. So that's a vibrating. Imagine here a vibrating plate. Pour sand on this sand or salt on this vibrating plane. And you'll see that at particular frequency, you've probably seen this experiment, you have to have, the sand will start to form certain patterns. So for example, here at certain frequencies, we call them actually harmonic frequencies, the sand will form very particular shapes, very particular patterns that are completely driven by the shape, the geometry of the vibrating plate here. So that's actually very cool properties to find matching. And when you think about this, anything can vibrate, including regular meshes here. Why not? For example, here this horse. So the color here, you see the amplitudes, how much a horse or how much a mesh here would vibrate at different frequencies, from low to higher frequencies, higher harmonics. But what is interesting here, if you look more closely to very equivalent points, the vibration characteristics, the vibration amplitudes. For example, if you see the front left leg, for example, it would have the same vibration characteristic, even though the mesh itself or the horse is galloping between those two different configurations of mesh. So, for example, in the lowest frequency, the front left leg would be green. Second harmonic would be blue. Third harmonic would be greenish again, and then yellow, and so on. And then if you move a lot those x, y, z coordinates, so that would become hard to find a matching using this x, y, z's because it moves a lot those points. But using those vibration characteristics, it's exactly the same characteristics whatever the positions of those legs are. So that's a very strong property, very useful to find matching problems. How to do that? For example, that's how a brain would vibrate. We take the mesh, the triangulated mesh, we construct a graph. From a graph, we have nodes and edges. Imagine from a triangle, neighboring nodes, node I, node J, you have a distance between them. I'm simplifying a bit, but node I, node J, the distance, you report them in a matrix, row, column, ij. You report those distances in the matrix there. We call this the graph Laplacian. And then we decompose, we find the eigenvalues and the eigenvectors of this graph Laplacian matrix. And that's how you get those vibration properties of the, for example, one brain. So you have two, for the upper row, one brain, second row would be a second brain. And you see, even though the brains are very, very different in terms of detailed geometry, but they do vibrate in a very similar way. And that's the properties we'll use to find the matching between those two brains. So for example, one point, how to find the equivalent point on somebody else's brain. And if you look closely, the first three harmonics, the first three columns, those are exactly the shape coordinates that I was mentioning, or that we were trying to find earlier on. So that's very convenient, very easy to get. And another way to represent shapes, instead of plotting the points using the x, y, z coordinates, that's what you get. That's what you get here. What if you plot them using those three first shape coordinates? That means for every point, you plot using MATLAB, Python, whatever. You plot them not using the x, y, z coordinates, but you plot them what we call the first three spectral coordinates, shape coordinates. Those are the blobbish shapes that you get. So those two brains, very different geometry in the Euclidean space, but they're very, very similar in the spectral, in the shape domain, let's say, in the shape space, spectral shape. So that's now you start to understand a bit or see why matching is much more easier in a spectral domain. So that's the strong property that we use for finding matching. So in terms of energy or mathematics here, functional loss function here, we do try to minimize what are the equivalent vibration or spectral or shape properties between equivalent points. That's how we find the mapping between those two branes here. We can adopt more data surfaces, data on surfaces, for example, sulcal depth, sulcal, the cortical thickness could be another one, functional data could be another one. So if we think in terms of data functional loss, we have a data term, those are data that lives on the surface. And you have a spatial or a surface regularization term here. That means you want to have neighbors alike on the surface itself. So if we simply minimize this, that's a very as simple as finding the nearest neighbors on this surface here. We immediately get those matching here. So that's as simple as that. We find simply nearest neighbor searches on the spectral domain, not on the Euclidean space, but on the spectral or the shape domain. And that's how we find those spectral matching here. So that takes less than a minute here, a few seconds. That's why it's so convenient. So yeah, so from the work, we're trying to move away from the Euclidean space, that's on your left here, and moving towards the spectral domain, the spectral space here, that's on your right here. So in terms of results here, free surfer is the typical inflation method that we were mentioning. That's what is typically used in the brain matching. 84% of performance, spherical demons, that's another one, 85. And then spectral matching, 83. So 83, 84, 85 is more or less the same thing to me. But what really, really matters to me is the huge, the drastic, in fact, speed improvement here from a few hours or a few hours to less than a minute. So that's what spectral method allows you to do. So that's all fine, matching and all. But what does it have to do with learning all this? So let's have a look. We want to have kernels again on moving away from a grid towards something that lives on the surface here. So we've seen how to build shape or surface parameterization, shape spectral coordinates, we call them. So we want to have an intrinsic, we call this an intrinsic shape parameterization. It totally depends on the surface itself. It has nothing to do with the XYZ coordinates, which can be moving a lot here. So we've seen how to do that using these vibration properties, those spectral shape characteristics that we have on brains, for example, any type of shape, in fact. So those are, we use the first, the lowest frequency, the lowest harmonics of the shape vibration. So imagine here we have a some data that lives on a mesh here. For example, it could be the depth of every point across the surface. Imagine we have a data set. So if you run through, imagine you take a random algorithm, could be random forest, for example, very simple one, easier to understand maybe. And then you feed those input data. Every vertex, every data from every vertex would actually fall in the tree node. And then you would navigate through this node, through this tree to find the classification at the end. So the random forest, basically in a nutshell, is simply a series. It tries to learn a series of very simple tests. And that's how we would navigate down the tree. So for example, the first one, is it positive or negative data? Yes or no, and then you go left and right depending on how you navigate your tree here. And that's how you end up eventually having your, if you do this for all the points, that's how you get, for example, your parcellation, how you find a segmentation problem on the brain. That's all great. Could be, for example, neural nets, why not as well? But how do you represent shape, how do you represent, space again here? So every point, that's fine. We have data on the point, but how do you represent its spatial representation? So naively, we can think of using the raw data as XYZ coordinates. That's what we have. So that's okay. Let's feed the data. We have our data on the surface in, for example, here depth in centimeters, plus. So that's a huge matrix, a vector here. Every vertex has data, minus 1.1 centimeter, for example, and then its position of the vertex 0.1, 12, 0.4, 1.3, XYZ coordinates. We have a matrix like this. We feed this into our favorite algorithm. For example, here it could be the random forest, and that's what we would get here. We're trying to segment where is the visual cortex. And that's the portion in the back of the brain here. Red is what you should get, and black is what you get here with your this setting here. So you input this using XYZ coordinates, you end up with something that is extremely bad, to be honest. You have like black spots everywhere. You have we call them small islands here and there. It's all disconnected. One simple reason is neighboring points. If you use those XYZ coordinates, again, close points, XYZs, but points can be very far apart on the surface if you navigate the surface. So the algorithm is all confused here. That's why you get this confusion here. So it's all great, but interesting. That's a strange problem here. That's okay. But if we move away and then we start to move away from XYZ coordinates, and what if we use those spectral coordinates what we had earlier on here? For example, which is simply a very simple change from XYZs, we replace them by using the spectral coordinates that we had before. Shape coordinates, spectral coordinates, that's vibration coordinates, and that's what we call them. A very simple change, only this change, and let's see what it looks like. So from something that was actually bad, we went to almost 92% to segment the visual cortex here. So basically, why does it work here? It's the main difference. This very simple change actually makes a fundamental change here in the way the algorithm is starting to work here. We moved away for something that is not necessarily dealing with the geometry itself of the shape we're dealing with, towards we're moving towards something that is completely driven by the shape. Here we have a representation, a coordinate that actually lives on the surface itself. So that's why it actually learns what's happening on the geometry of the brain. And that's why it works much better than using Cartesian or Euclidean XYZ coordinates. So that's what we do if we want to segment all the brain parcels that we have using Cartesian Euclidean coordinates, XYZs. So that's actually very bad here. Again, very simple change, move away from XYZs towards those spectral coordinates. Simple change, and that's what we get here. Let me move a bit my head so then you can better appreciate. You see here, it's much more regularized. It's really something's happening directly on the surface. The learning now is we say it's geometry aware now, so that's much more interesting. So that's a very simple way using very simple random forest to learn directly on the surface. So now let's move to something more interesting, or more complex, or for example the geometric deep learning. So in the recent years, there has been a few new attempts to move those ideas towards neural networks. So let's have some background here first. Imagine you have an image. So one naive way to do a segmentation, we're really starting from the basics here. Let's vectorize an image. So from one image, we vectorize from every pixel. We have a very simple weighting layer here. So it's simply a multiplication here. That's our update, or that's how we construct our layers here. So we simply multiply our weights with the inputs layer data, and that's how we get our outputs data. That's okay. And then we can actually stack all those layers to build those deep learning, deep networks here. That's okay, but what if, for example, Lena here, what if the content of the image starts to move around within the image? We'll start to get into trouble here. So that's one of the main reasons why convolutional neural nets happen. So the idea here is to try to, instead of having the image that moves around, what if we have a convolution? That's a small portion of the window that moves around with us. So that's the main idea of having those convolutional neural nets. So you can cascade again those layers, end up with a classical small neural net at the end. That's the update equation that we have here. So in practice, it's also a multiplication. we have again weights or the filter, the kernel filters, kernel weights that we want to learn here. And again, that's what we convolve the input data to get our output data. But that's fine. That's if we have an image. Let me hide a bit here. That's fine. If we have an image, that's okay. But how do we define neighborhood? How do we define convolution kernels on something that is not an image anymore, but on a graph? Like, how do you convolve? Where do you go left? Where do you go right? What is up and down on a graph, for example, particularly on a brain? So that's how what we'll see here. So to perform a convolution on a surface, let's maybe remember a bit from what we saw in our typical signal processing classes in university. So remember that convolution is simply a multiplication in our Fourier space. So that's very useful. So that's a very powerful property to use. So from this property, the convolution again can be represented or can be computed as a multiplication in the Fourier space. And Fourier is in fact the vibration properties that we have here. So in the initial attempts of spectral, that's why it's called spectral as well, spectral graph convolutions. These filter weights are simply approximated using a polynomial for convenience reasons. Chebyshev polynomials. That's easy to represent, so that's easy to compute as well. That's what it was initially used to actually try to approximate the kernel weights. First order Chebyshev polynomials are good. And why not as well, even using a single parameter one. So that's if you look closely here, that's a single parameter to learn here. So that's here we have the convolution simply becomes, I'm sparing you a bit the math here. It's simply becoming a convolution, simply becoming a multiplication here with a degree matrix, that's D, an adjacency matrix here, and a polynomial or a representation of the weight, the kernel weights, that is simplified to one single element here. This is theta here. So from this segment, from this simplification here, that's how we build our update rule, or how do we construct our layers here. We have again our convolution simply become here a multiplication. So if we look closer, that's the input data. How do we do this on the map? We have on a graph. We have our input layer, that's our data that lives on the graph here. We move towards, no, we're not moving towards, we simply multiply here with the weights that we have here. So again, every input layer data is multiplied by the D is the degree again of the node itself. The adjacency A is some kind of affinity value that we have between our neighbors I and J. So that's a simple multiplication if you think, if you really look closer to it. And that simply gives us the output layer that we want here. So the convolution on graph is thanks to this simplification using this polynomial. Chebyshev polynomial, could be other ones, Calais ones as another one. It could be simply splines as well, why not? But it becomes a multiplication of the input points using the adjacencies of the nodes, and that's how we get the output layer nodes. And once we have that, that's okay. We can stack and cascade those layers. But when you look closer again, we have one single parameter here. So that's a bit too simple. That's a bit too naive to really think of something more fancy. So that's one way of doing this. So again, here some cascaded layers, some cascaded graph node inputs that we have. We can cascade different layers to get an output values on the graph nodes. But again, this approach on using a simplified polynomial, that you don't get anything fancy here, but you can have multiple filters, multiple thetas, That's okay, you get a little bit more, but still it's not very fancy or rich kernels that we have here. And again, you're constrained here to a fixed graph structure. So the structure of your graph here has to be fixed. It's always the same graph that you learn. So one way to try to build richer kernels. This is not a spectral graph convolution anymore, but we call them a spatial graph convolution here. So we do have here a regular mesh. Imagine tangent plates now on the graph here. And on these tangent plates, you can have like small patches, and those patches can be represented using a polar coordinate system. So that's great. So using those polar coordinates, you can learn different values that spreads within a small neighborhood of a point here. So that builds up a small kernel here, a small filter, and that's what you can learn using the polar coordinates here. So you build again any type of architectures that you want to have, and then you learn those filter weights here. That's how those geometrical deep learning approach, spatial approaches that are typically used, and they work actually pretty well on regular meshes here. But how do you parameterize really the kernels here? So here we're learning filter weights, multiple weights, but how do you build kernels? How do you define a Gaussian, for example, here? So you can have so here again, weight, a convolution here, we want to learn those convolutions. So with the spectral weights here, not the spectral weights, sorry, the spatial weights that we had here on the polar space, on the polar coordinate here, that's the previous approach. It can be simplified or formalized as we call the geodesic CNN. Simply values around the neighborhood. You can have asymmetric, anisotropic kernels, why not? Or something more fancy, you can have a mixture of the different kernels here. And what you would learn would be the kernel centers and the kernel covariance matrices. So here we have a richer kernels. That's good. How do you define, however, the orientation? How do you define the orientation of these patches? And how do you construct those patches? So how do you define, for example, how do you define the angle 0 for theta here? So to construct the patches, we walk across triangles, so along like some kind of a geodesic shooting. So you walk along small triangles and how you construct the patches. So you start to think that raises trouble here in terms of algorithmic or if you want to code this, that start to be a bit costly. The patch orientation in these methods is has to be one choice. So the choice is to find the line of maximum curvature. So that's why not. It's slightly arbitrary. But if you walk on a brane surface, that starts to be a bit complicated. So let's recap a bit. Let's recap a bit our limitations here. We showed that we have images, fine. We have algorithm on images. If we want to work on surfaces, highly folded surfaces such as the brane, well, we have an ambiguity on distances. 2 points can be very close to each other in the volume, neighboring pixels. But if you look closely, the distance between those 2 points can be very, very far away apart. So that creates confusion for our learning algorithms. And then if you really want to work directly on the surface, how do you really navigate on them? On an image, you have a grid, you know where is your point on the left, on the right, but on the surface, there's even cases where it can even become upside down if you walk on the surface itself. And then I raise the question of how to define the coordinate systems as well. So far in the literature, we have coordinate system that rely on a spatial domain. For example, polar coordinates on small patches. But how do you define, for example, the angle 0? Where do you define this angle? Could be, for example, the angle of maximum curvature. But you start to see trouble here if you, again, want to walk on the surface. So again, confusing for learning filters in that case as well. We have shown that the inherent problem is how to represent coordinates on the mesh. So from a grid, how do you move to surfaces? So the Euclidean space, Euclidean coordinates, x, y, z points, is a bit inadequate for surfaces. So that was the main problem on the create all the limitations on brane surfaces. Another thing as well is another great aspect is the graph structure. You don't necessarily have a nice quadrilated quadrants, for example, on the triangulated surface. You may have different structure, graph structure here. So how do you define a coordinate on something that really changes structure? So that's not easy. All that, yeah. How do we represent surface coordinates on a surface, shape coordinates? So we've seen convolutions. That's fun on an image, but on a brane, how do you do a convolution? How do you move around kernels on the surface? How do you navigate them? So that's the open question. Pooling. This is due to the change of the graph structure. The nodes, the number of nodes can be different, for example. Whereas on an image, it's easy to aggregate or to pool different downsample, basically portions of the image, to have a convolution, to have a pooling system that aggregates values towards 1 pixels. But on a mesh, that's not necessarily easy. For example, here you can have multiple 300,000 nodes, for example. You want to move up to 10,000 nodes, for example. How do you aggregate that? So those are the limitations we face. And that's why, so for the next part of the presentation, I'm going to propose two solutions. One on the convolutions, and one on the pooling aspect for the graph geometry deployment. Something that goes beyond the recent literature on graph convolutions. If you want to work, if you want to use them on medical imaging, for example, the brain surface. So those could be two solutions for you. So the first one, how do you do graph convolutions or localized graph convolutions on brain surfaces? Could be brain surfaces, but any highly folded or any complex surface, for example. So that's mostly the work done by Kartik Gopinath in our lab. So if we remind ourselves, how do you do convolutions on an image? That's fine. If you want to move, the general idea here is if you want to move them on a surface, here would have been a video of a kernel response here moving around the brain. The whole general idea is to move away from Euclidean coordinates and move them towards spectral coordinates, so shape coordinates. So you have those graph here. So those meshes. From those meshes, you build a graph. Again, for two neighboring points, you construct a graph Laplacian matrix. So this is a matrix that reports basically affinities between graph nodes. You compute the eigenvectors from this graph Laplacian, and you end up with the harmonics, the shape harmonics, or how basically a shape or a brain here would vibrate under different harmonics, from low harmonics towards high frequency harmonics. So you see the higher frequency you go, the more smaller detail starts to be described here. The first three eigenmodes, the first three eigenvectors, those are the ones that will be used to describe in a unique fashion every point on the surface here. As an illustration, on the right side, those two guys there, the RGB colors has been color coded. The points has been color coded with the first three eigenvectors values as RGB components. So you see that equivalent points have exactly the same color. So it's all fine, but in the spectral shape literature, there's a unsolved problem a bit. It's the spectral basis, the eigenvectors, the basis, they're ambiguous to rotation. So they are they variants, in fact, they dependent on a particular rotation. So that's why in a different type of work, including work we did in the past as well, we try to optimize and try to find the best transformation from every independent eigenbasis, independent eigenvectors, and we merge them, we fuse them towards the eigenvectors of a reference brane. So again, from a standard convolution, so this is here the update value, or how do we compute basically a convolution here on an image. If you want to move them on a graph surface, if you have different for one kernel here, let me move myself out. You have the weights that you multiply with a certain kernel here. Here the kernel would be 5. That's the second line. And what we would learn here, instead of the kernel weights in the image case, here we would learn the center and the Gaussian covariance matrices on the surface here. So that's what we saw a typical way, as we see in the last part as well, on the geometric deep learning. So once you know how to learn them, you can build the architecture that you want. So here we just cascaded a few eigenvectors, a few convolution layers here. And what you would learn here would be the Gaussian or the kernel centers and the kernel covariances. The main difference here is that now you learn directly on the surface itself. So instead of using XYZs as in the regular geometric deep learning methods, now you simply it's a simple replacement of the XYZ coordinate systems using the spectral eigenvectors, the spectral coordinates. So this simple change here, so in the code is not that much changes, but it's this simple change makes a fundamental difference. Now the learning really happens, it really occurs directly on the surface itself. So this is in fact mostly, so I have to give credit, it's mostly work from Kartik here, Kartik in our lab. So this is an example of how different layer responses, for example, the very initial layers, you have them on more coarser areas that do respond to different weights. And the further deep you go, you start to have more details being highlighted by the latest layers here. In the very end, here in that particular cases, the output would be the probabilities of each parcels. We wanted to have the parcellations a bit like this guy. I feel like the weatherman who has to point on the blue screen. But again, you choose or you build the architectures you want here. In that particular case, it was for a parcellation. So the major change here would be, and that makes a fundamental change here, is to operate on a spectral domain here. The loss function can be, for example, here the cross entropy, where you would learn from a ground truth data set, so you have a manual parcellations here, that will try to learn the predicted probabilities. And what you would learn again is the kernel parameters, the weights, the centers, the covariances, the biases. So as an experiment, just to make sure we're not doing something completely off, we're gonna try to, we used MindBoggle. So this is a public data set. That's one of the largest public data set of manually labeled images, labeled surfaces, sorry. So that's convenient to check and to compare ourselves as well with the state of the art. So it's a manual parcellation of 32 labels on the surface. So we tested different combinations of how many layers should we be using, how many kernels. We found an optimum of, in that particular case, of a parcellations. We found 4 layers and 6 small kernels. That's enough. So that's what we use in these experiments. For example, here, if you want to segment a ground truth somewhere in around the Broca area, for example, the language speech area, might be a different one, though, but I don't remember which parcel, but one parcel basically. So here you see the evolution from a learning initially learning epoch with epoch 1, for example. You have basically very random responses, and the further you go in the training, you start to have a learning that is more convergent towards the final solution. Our results, we find 86% more or less. If you want to compare with the geometric deep learning that operates on Euclidean coordinates, so x, y, z's, so you see a major difference here with 50%, we're doing 86%. So the single difference here is moving away from Euclidean towards spectral coordinates. So the simple change makes it a fundamental change in the algorithm, the way it operates. So that explains actually this drastic improvement in this performance. FreeSurfer, the most popular software to brain parcellation, operates at 84%. So we're more or less better. That's for the whole parcels here, so all the brain parcels. If we want to compare with an Euclidean forest, that's what we have. Again, very bad because it's Euclidean and maybe less fancy than deep learning. Spectral forests, we jump to 79%, 45 to 79, only by operating on a spectral domain. If we use a spectral matching, as we saw earlier, we have something similar, 77%. Geometric deep learning on the Euclidean domain, we have 50%. Again, same reasons why it doesn't operate good on the Euclidean domain. If we move everything on the spectral domain, that's our method, we jump to 85%. So that's very better here. We can even improve a bit by regularizing a bit our parcels. So it looks and measures us a little bit better. So we jump to 86% here. One of the major advantage here is everything operates on the testing side. Everything operates within seconds compared to hours for FreeSurfer. So that's a good advantage to be using geometric deep learning on brain surfaces. So that's it. We saw that graph convolutions not on the typical way on the spatial domain, but moving away from the Euclidean towards spectral endings. We show that this brings a major improvement on the how the parcels are formed. The learning basically occurs directly, operates directly on the surface. So that creates all those improvements in speed and performance side. And now the second contribution, or the second proposal that we wanted to show is how do you do pooling on a graph structure. What is meant by graph pooling? Imagine we have a problem where we have a typical learning, for example, from n nodes. We have data on n nodes. That's fine. We just saw that we can do graph convolutions on the brain. If you want to do a classification or regression all the way down to one parameter, one output, for example, one feature of one dimension, then you get, in that case, you would get from n endpoints to one dimension, one output here. So that's okay, but that's a major aggregation that we're doing here, major pooling here from n to 1. They basically, you consider all the nodes equally here. It considers the whole brain as basically one entity, one cluster. You do an average across the whole brain, irrespective on how the nodes should behave differently. And so basically, by going from n to 1, we completely lose as well any shape information that we do have, all the rich information that we do have on the geometrical aspect of the brain. So one question is how to do a pooling, how do you downscale, how do you aggregate your learning from n to, let's say, to n to p, or n different n's, basically layers. From layer with a certain number of nodes to a layer with a lower number of nodes. Basically, you want to do a meaningful pooling here. How would you do that? So there's different approaches, preliminary approaches. One of them is using spectral k-means. So you form clusters on a set of points, for example. So as in typical machine learning algorithm, if you have a cloud of points, you can find clustering among those cloud of points. K-means is one method. And then every cluster forms a node. So that's one approach. Why not? However, you somehow rely, not somehow, but you do rely on the number of clusters to choose. That's an initialization that is required in the K-means algorithm. Every cluster as well has to have the same number of nodes. So it's not necessarily convenient. And then you totally rely on the clustering aspect. So one, for example, in this approach by differential pooling, diffpool, it forms their clusters by learning an assignment between points and the cluster. So basically tries to find the best assignment. How do you should assign every points to a cluster here? So that is something that is learned in that case. So that's good. However, it's completely both cases, in fact, completely it's independent from the task that is done, and we don't necessarily rely on the general shape or the intrinsic shape of the underlying surface that we're dealing with. I'll show what is meant here. So, for example, imagine from a brain, you can extract how it reacts on the spectral coordinates, the shape coordinates. You can have so those are the top three eigenvectors that you would have there, the colorful points. You can have extra data that you have on the surface. For example, one of them is focal depth, the other one is cortical thickness. That's data that lives on the surface as well. The way it's done, we built two paths. One path would learn how to assign nodes to clusters, a bit similarly to the method that we just did earlier. Another path would learn the features, different sets of features to do a particular task. Then we merge those two features to eventually end up with a node or with a layer with a certain number of nodes. This layer would have in fact C nodes, C clusters. So it somehow clusters all the points towards C new nodes in the new layer. How it is merged from the cluster assigned, a cluster assignment, which is learned by a vector S of probabilities here. You merge them with the node path, which learn the node features. So you simply do an expected convolution here, an expected value of the convolution. So it's basically an average weight of the expected what a convolution value should be within each cluster here. So that's what would constitute the value of a new node here. So you have a new node. The value of this node would be the average value, let's say the average value of the the convolution value over the whole cluster. So that's another node here, a new average value across the whole cluster here, another node. So you can do multiple nodes as is. And then to build the edges, you do the same thing here. So here would be the adjacency matrix here. So you basically try to learn, so that would be the average, let's say how to say that, the average edge weight that would belong between those two clusters here. If you have a cluster C and cluster D, what is the average value of all the edge weights connecting them? So that's one possible way to describe it. So now we have one way to build a node, and we have one way to put a weight on the new edge on the new layer here. So we have a way to build a new node and a new edge, and so that constitutes one block of convolution plus pooling here in that case. And of course, you can cascade, you can stack multiple blocks. Such as this one, convolution pooling, and so on. to eventually each one of them maybe can decrease the number of nodes size of the layers. In the very end, you can even have a small fully connected one to do your classification or regression task. The last function can be again a cross entropy, that means square error. You choose your favorite one. We do add some regularization loss as well, and in terms of matrix forms, so we simply multiply by the Laplacian. That's actually convenient. It avoids, so otherwise it's a bit hard to train the pooling path in particular. And it also avoids, spurious local minimum. So that basically constrain a bit the problem here towards a solution that is better. So our results, we try to do this on the same data set and add me as well. So first we do a sex classification, sex or gender classification on the based on the shape of the brain. So here's different possible pooling, different clustering from different methods here. So spectral k-means, you completely rely on k-means, and that's what you would get. That's on the very left side. On the middle, you have a fixed set of parcels. So we use the parcellation of the brain itself as clusters, and we want to make sure that we're not doing something crazy with our own algorithms. It serves a bit as a baseline. And here on top, this is what we get with our learned clusters. So this is what the clusters, how the clusters are learned in our methods. So that's what the method outputs in that case. So you see that those clusters are not completely random. They do actually form something that is related somehow to the real parcels that we do have now. So those are the results we have here. So our learning method, learnable pooling in our case, would do a sex classification, so it's a binary one, of 84%, only based on the geometry here. Spectral clustering would perform at 67%. And using a fixed parcellation, you would perform again at 64%. So you see again an improvement here because we can learn how the pooling should be done based on a learning that occurs directly on the surface here. So that's the major difference here. Geometry-based pooling. Yeah, so it does improve the classification methods. We try to do a classification now just to make sure we're not doing something completely random as well. We want to classify each brain of 3 categories: normal, mild cognition, cognitive impairments here, and Alzheimer's disease subjects here. So the data set, the results here in our case, not in our case, but in the baseline that we used. So the baseline here, we chose this baseline because it used only pointwise information, no neighborhood information at all. So we just wanted to compare how it goes from using convolution or a neighborhood towards pooling a neighborhoods, towards pointwise informations. So you have values around the 60%. If you add some kind of neighborhood within a pooling structure using graph deep learning, but no geometrical information here, you jump from 60% to roughly, let's say, in the 70% here. And if you do add, a geometrical information, that means you force the learning to occur, the pooling to occur, and the convolution and so on. But you force it to occur on the surface. You jump from the 70 to the high 90s, 80s, percent. So that's not that bad. And again, this is all occurring because it's geometry based here in that case. So here we do another experiment. We do assume that we can model, as a biomarker for Alzheimer's diseases. Here we try to see if this is a good approach or not. So one assumption here is like if we learn this. If we learn, for example, if you try to regress or predict the age based on a model that has been trained only on healthy subjects. For example, you train only on healthy subjects, so you try to learn the normal aging behavior. And from this normal aging behavior, you try to predict the age here. So then once you have a trained model, you input you input healthy subjects, so if it should output the right age, so that's okay. But if for an Alzheimer's disease person, if the predicted age significantly is very different from the predicted age from the real age, that means maybe the person is aging, or the brain itself, or the shape of the brain is showing a much more aged brain than what the person really is. So maybe it's a symptom, or maybe it's a sign that the person has Alzheimer's, or something that makes the brain age faster in that case. So if we train again a model only on healthy subjects, that's the results we have. So we have an error of about 4 years. Then if the predicted age and the real age of the person is more or less 3-4 years of difference. So that's a performance we can get. From this model that has been trained on healthy subject, if we input subject with Alzheimer's, those are the errors we got here. So this error that we have here is higher. So we don't have 3 or 4 years, but we have more like 5, 6, 7 years of difference here. So that shows basically that for patients that has been flagged as Alzheimer's, let's say the geometry age, what our model predicts as a geometry age shows much older brains than the real age of the person. So it's basically showing that the person with his geometry has signs that his brain is aging faster. So that's one way to maybe see that the brain, the subject is developing something wrong as Alzheimer's, for example. So the geometry age here deviates from the normal age here. So in the last couple slides, we showed how convolutions can be made on the graph using spectral embeddings. We also showed how these embeddings can be useful to do pooling directly on the brains, on the graph side. So we have one way to do pooling. We have one way to do convolutions. So we have all the tools to do our most fancy graph architectures. So it's all there to you to use now. And as a conclusion now maybe it's time to recap. So if you have to remember one thing, so if we summarize the whole presentation that we've done in the past hour and 15 minutes, let's say. First part, we showed how parameterization can occur on a shape. We use for these spectral coordinates. Those are useful because it does describe intrinsic ways. It does give an intrinsic representation of the shape. So instead of using something that is we call extrinsic XYZ coordinates, we move them away and we go towards a shape coordinates. Spectral coordinates we call them. So we should spend the first part of the talk explaining a bit of this. We showed as well a bit on geometric deep learning, how it is done on the typical computer vision algorithm, using graphs that are fixed, not too complex, highly folded like this. But then we moved away and then we showed how this can be used on brain surfaces. So it requires to rethink completely the method. And by rethinking, we moved everything to the spectral domain, a bit like the vibration modes and simple change in terms of code or in terms of math, but fundamental change in how the algorithm operates here. So we can have convolutions directly on the surface, and we saw how to do pooling as well on the surface here. So take home message here, if you have to remember one thing or two things from this whole talk. If you want to do graph convolutions or pooling, maybe try to have a look on how they would look like on the spectral shapes, on the spectral domain. They're much simpler to use and operate. And what happens fundamentally here, the learning of the convolution kernels parameters and the learning of the pooling as well. Fundamentally, the learning now occurs directly on the surface. So that creates all sorts of advantages and benefits. We saw actually huge drastic improvements in performance. Moving away as well from conventional methods, we have a much faster algorithm. That's the benefits of deep learning in general. But it's one thing to remember: graph pooling and graph convolutions. Just try them on the spectral shapes. So that's the main message here. So I do have to acknowledge and give credit to my colleagues here on this this theme, on this body of work. Kartik Gopinath, our student, and my colleague here, Professor Christian Derosier. There's some funding here to acknowledge. So that's, I should move a bit. So that's we should see that. That's part of how this whole research is possible. And that's it. So that's the presentation so far. And see you after the video finishes. Bye.